So some of the smells that you should be looking for in your code that indicate you might be violating the interface segregation principle include unimplemented interface methods. Whether it's an abstract class or any kind of base class or an actual interface, if you find in your code things where you're overriding methods from your base class or your base interface and then simply throwing a new non-implemented exception or doing some other kind of degenerate implementation, you should realize that this is probably violating ISP, because clearly the class that's using this implementation is not using this particular method, and therefore it's using a smaller subset of the actual interface that it's being forced to depend upon. Remember too that these violate the Liskov substitution principle, because now these degenerate classes will not be substitutable for their base classes when clients expect for all of these interfaces, the entire interface, to be implemented and all the methods to do something useful. Another smell is when you have a client that references a class, but it only uses a small portion of it. This is very similar to the last smell, but not quite exactly the same. This is more from the client side rather than from the implementation side. When you see this, sometimes you can make a facade or some other kind of class that your class depends on, and it makes it so that you're not depending upon the larger class, which is perhaps more likely to change and break your class. When should we fix violations of the interface segregation principle? Like most of these principles, you really only want to address them if there's pain. If there's no pain, then there's not really a problem that needs to be attended to, and you should continue adding new features and fixing bugs and generally adding value to your application. However, if you find yourself depending on a fat interface that you own, and this is causing problems because of the dependencies involved, the best thing to do is to create a smaller interface that has just what the client needs, have the fat interface implement this new interface, as we just did with our demo, and then reference the new interface within your client code, ignoring the fat interface now. If you find fat interfaces are problematic, but you don't own them, for instance, if you had the example I showed with the membership provider that's built into the .NET framework, something that you can do is create a smaller interface with just what you need, and then implement this interface using an adapter that implements the full interface. So this would allow you to basically work with a subset of the large interface, and the adapter would be between you and the third-party interface that you don't have control over. So some basic tips for the interface segregation principle: keep your interfaces small, cohesive, and focused. Whenever possible, you want to let the client define the interface, because this will ensure that the interface really only includes what the client needs. And also, whenever possible, package the interface with the client. Alternately, you can package the interface in a third assembly that both the client and implementation depend upon, and only as a last resort should you try and package up interfaces with their implementation.